Hi, Norman Swan here with the first Work Better, Live Better series of the series produced by Medibank, coming to you from Medibank. And so welcome to 2023, although you've been welcome plenty of times before. I'll tell you what this session's about in a minute, but my name is Dr. Norman Swan. I produce and present the Health Report on Radio National, CoronaCast, which is a podcast about the coronavirus. Also, I'm a reporter on 7:30 and occasionally on Four Corners. So it's great to be with you today. I've also written a couple of books recently, which loosely I'm using content from those books to talk to you today, because why waste some good research that's evidence-based, to talk about heart health, because it is Heart Health Month. It's important, before I talk any longer, to acknowledge country. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land. That's part of the Eora Nation. I want to pay my respects to yesterday's elders, today's elders, and most important of all, tomorrow's elders. This is Aboriginal land. It always was Aboriginal land and always will be Aboriginal land. And I pay my respects to any First Nations peoples watching today. So I just want to remind you that this is interactive. There's the chat session. You've had 3 years of this, you know it by now. Put your questions in there and I'll get to them either during the conversation, or certainly I'll leave about 15 minutes towards the end for lots of interaction, which is where I find you really get what you want out of the session. So you think you know what's good for your heart. And there are takeaways here for the workplace and for workplace health. Should I tell you them now? Maybe I'll tell you some of them now and we'll come back to that later. One of the important things for anybody watching this individually, no matter what your age, whether you're in your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, or whatever, is know your risk. It's really important at any age to know what your risk is, particularly of heart disease, but cancer as well. Know what people died of in your family. This sounds really macabre, I know. And I cover this in my book, So You Want to Live Younger Longer. Is the younger you are, it's actually, that's the time that there are enough people alive in your family that you can tell what the patterns of disease are in your families. So for example, if there's a pattern of people getting diagnosed with a specific cancer, 2 or 3 people in your family with breast cancer, or a pattern of breast cancer plus prostate cancer, then you want to talk to your GP about whether or not you need genetic testing, whether there's a cancer gene in your family. And if you know that, then there's things that you can do, surveillance and behavioral changes and other things that can actually prevent you getting cancer. But with heart disease, is there a pattern in your family of people developing heart disease? They don't have to die of it, but they first diagnosed with heart disease under the age of 60, maybe even more acutely under the age of 50. And if there's that pattern in your family, it's really important you know about it, and it's really important you talk to your GP about getting the full range of tests to see what that risk might be, if indeed you have any at all. And the good news is a lot of people don't have any risk, so you haven't inherited whatever the gene is in that part of your family. So know your family risk, but also know your personal risk. Now, GPs tend to be focused on the over 50s because that's what they've been taught. Those are people at higher risk. But the reality is, if you're in your 20s or 30s and your cholesterol's up a bit, or your blood pressure's up a bit, that's a lot of decades that you've got with your blood pressure battering away at you, or your cholesterol silting up your artery. So before it even gets to that point where you've got a problem, it's good to know that you've got it. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've got to go on medication, quite the opposite. But it does mean that you could get onto a pattern, which I'll talk about later, which is a pattern which reduces your risk and reduces your risk quite dramatically. And the occasional person will turn up in their 20s or 30s with very high blood pressure out of the blue, or very high cholesterol, in which case you will probably need medication if lifestyle changes don't bring it down. And that will be life-saving. So know your risk. And in your 20s and 30s, you only need to know it once. Just go to the GP, get your own GP, by the way. So that's a really important thing about your health and well-being. Get your own GP so they get to know you. And once a decade, just know what it is. And if it's normal or low, great news. and the testing gets a little bit more common as you get older, but it doesn't, there's almost no point where it needs to be annual if you're otherwise healthy. In fact, there's probably more harm in getting too much testing as you get older. So if you're otherwise healthy and you know it, take your advice to your GP, but the annual checkup, there's very limited value to the annual checkup because things don't change. And the other thing, and I'm departing from the heart health thing, is that if you're eligible for cancer screening, get it done. Wouldn't it be a tragedy if you developed a cancer that you didn't need to develop because you haven't done your screening? So in women, it's cervical cancer screening from the age of 25 every 5 years with the new technology. Women again over the age of 50 with breast cancer screening. With everybody over 50 is bowel cancer screening. And the irony here, of course, is with bowel cancer screening, is that about 60% of the population would rather die or have a colostomy or have really toxic chemotherapy than actually do the poo test and send it in. So for those of you under 50, you don't know what I'm talking about. You get this annual poo test that comes through, and all you got to do is put your poo on this thing, send it back to see if there's blood in it. If there is, then you need more testing. It doesn't mean you've got cancer, but it means you're at higher risk of cancer. People don't do it. I find it constantly amazing. And so they'd rather die of colon cancer or bowel cancer than just do the poo test. For God's sake, just do the poo test. So let's come back to what we're, enough diversions, enough talking about what we're talking about, which is heart health. And I'm probably going to start from a place that you might not expect me to start. And it's a long way from the heart. It's the head. We tend to behave as though the brain and mind are separate. That there's something precious about the brain and mind, and that and it somehow has a life of its own, independent of the body. Now, we all know that's not true. I mean, a moment's thought tells you that's not true. It's connected to the rest of the body. But we're somehow surprised when the brain affects the rest of the body. Sometimes people are insulted by the thought that your brain could have it, because then you tend to think, well, is the doctor telling me that it's all in my head? And usually it's not the doctor telling you it's all in the head, because some doctors are pretty tuned into this and holistic, and they know that what happens in your head affects the rest of your body. The message, if you forget nothing else from this session, the brain runs everything in the body, pretty much. And your brain is designed, we evolved, to survey our environment. So it's our physical environment, the temperature around us, the warmth, etc., but also what's happening at work, our relationships, the support we have around us, our emotional well-being. This sounds new agey and really, off the chart for some people. This is just soft stuff. It is, can I just tell you, it is not soft stuff. Because what happens is your brain picks up all this information through your eyes, through your ears, through the sense of touch, through your relationships, etc., through your situation at work, the pressure on you or the pressure that's not on you, as the case may be. And what your brain does is translates that into physical messages to the rest of your body. And those messages can have a profound effect on your heart health. So now, if you think that, again, this is soft, let me just describe a really fascinating experiment done in London in the British Civil Service, done by an Australian researcher called Michael Marmot. And it's called the Whitehall Study. So some of you will be old enough to remember the BBC series, comedy series called The Yes Prime Minister, which was set in the British Civil Service. It's very hierarchical. So from the bottom to the top, and you've got the top person who runs the department, this bureaucratic department. Usually he's got a knighthood. In the comedy series, his name was Sir Humphrey, and they tend to run the minister and so on. But what the problem that Michael Marmot was trying to solve, the question he was trying to answer was, why is there a health gradient in the world? And it's wherever you look. So if you live in Sydney or Melbourne, the train lines that go from the city centre out to the suburbs, the health gradient, that people's health gets poorer and poorer and poorer the further out into the suburbs, almost by railway station. Certainly in Sydney, as you go out west, every railway station, life expectancy goes down, heart disease goes up, the risk of cancer goes up. According to, if you look from poor to rich, between Aboriginal, First Nations communities and non-Aboriginal communities, there's a health gap. Some people live shorter lives, more unhappy lives, and some people live longer, youthful lives. And the question is why? So we tend to think, well, we know the answer to that. The people, so what he was trying to do was look at this British civil service about where there was a health gradient between the person who comes in at night to sweep the floors and clean the toilets to the Sir Humphrey who runs the department. So the Sir Humphrey lives longer and lives younger longer at the top. Why is that the case? So we all think we know the answer. It's that Sir Humphrey went to Oxford or Cambridge. This is in the British context, so they're well educated. That's the reason. And in fact, that's a pretty good answer because education makes an enormous difference to how well you live, how healthy you are, what age you get dementia. The more educated you are in your early years and in your teens and 20s, the later you get dementia, the later you get heart disease, the later you get cancer. So it's very potent, but it's not the whole answer, because if you extract statistically education from that health gradient, there's still a gradient, there's still something else going on. So you'd say, oh, well, it's cholesterol. No, doesn't make much of a difference. Well, it makes a bit of a difference, but that's still not the answer. It's so what Michael Marmot did was he factored in something called locus of control. Now, those of you who've done psychology, as I'm sure there are many of you who have, will now fail me in Psychology 101, but I'm about to describe locus of control. It's a simple question, really, which is, when I think about my life and work, where's my control? Is it here with me, or is it somewhere over there? So if you are a single parent with 3 kids on a pension, you don't feel your locus of control here. Your life is out of control, no matter how bright you are, how well read and educated and so on. If you are poor and burdened in a family situation, a disadvantage, you don't have a sense of locus of control here. It's over there. It's over there with the disadvantage, with somebody else controlling your life. If you're living in a First Nations community, an Aboriginal community, where your ownership and custodianship of the land is not recognized, where dislocation from the stolen generations is not there, you don't feel that your locus of control as a community is here. It's somewhere over there. If you're allowed to get on with your job and you're given clear direction and you know what your goals are, you feel good at work and your locus of control is here. But some people, maybe, the notorious one is call centers. If you're working in a call center that's not well run, then the locus of control is that you're pressured, you've got the scripts right, and you don't feel you've got control over your life. It's over there. So locus of control being here is really good. But if it's over there for whatever reason, then your brain picks that up. And it could be loneliness. It could be lack of social connection. All those things tend to take you over there. And when Michael Marmot factored in locus of control into the British civil service to try and explain the health gradient, it explained a lot of it. Still not all, but a lot of it. And what seemed to be happening is that when people lost their locus of control, they lost something called self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is about my ability to make decisions about work and life, about and be able to enact on those decisions and implement them. And what people have shown, for example, is that people with cancer, not long after the diagnosis of cancer, once they're in the system, they're getting chemo and radiation and so on, they lose their locus of control. It goes over there to the clinic, and they feel lack of self-efficacy and a sense of helplessness. Another researcher, Bruce McEwen, the late Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University in New York, which is one of the world's great research universities, many Nobel laureates. What he did was he took Michael Marmot's work and said, what's going on in the brain? Now he called, when the locus of control is over there, when you're lonely, when you don't have social support, there's a lot to this. He called it allostatic load. Now, stress is not all bad. In fact, some stress is really good. We can get onto that in the discussion if you want. I mean, for example, those of you who might have watched ABC television last night would have seen me getting into an ice bath. I joined an ice bath class. Maybe more on that later. I don't propose that to be your solution for heart health, but nonetheless, I try it out. But what that's about is actually stressing your system, and you feel better for having stressed it, both psychologically and physically. Intermittent fasting is about stressing your system, and high intensity intermittent training, the HIIT training is also stressing your system, and so these things are actually quite good for your metabolism and your body. So that's kind of acute stress. But if you've got this sense of loss of control, loss of social connection, and it's all happening, your brain perceives that. And it perceives it the way it might perceive an acute threat. So our brains are designed to respond to threats. Rather than nice things in life, we respond to the negative, unfortunately, more, because that's got survival. Just imagine, we're in the hunter-gatherer society and we're walking through the savanna grassland with our family group and walking through the long grass, and you hear a rustle in the grass. Well, you're less likely to turn around to your partner in life saying, "Oh, darling, it's a wonderful day and the sun's shining and the wind's blowing through the grass," rather than saying, "Shit, there's a tiger in the grass, run for your life." And that's how we tend to respond. Our brains are tuned to the negative, to what's going on in our environment. So what happens? So we all enjoy that acute stress, the ice bath, the bungee jump, the Big Dipper, or what have you, or not all of us. I hate the Big Dipper, but we respond to that. Or it's a thing that is protective, such as in warfare, in sport and other things. But it's designed to last a few minutes or an hour or two. What happens with this allostatic load is that this feeling that it's over there stresses the brain, but at a low level over a long period of time. And what happens is your brain is dumb, really. I mean, the conscious part of your brain's bright, but this is your dumb brain getting in on it, out of your control in a sense. And it says, what the hell's going on here? There's a threat in the environment. So it tells your heart to speed up. It tells your blood pressure to go up so that you're ready for the run, to the fight or flight. It tells your immune system to get ready for attack. Now, when your immune systems get ready for attack, there's 3 levels to your immune system. Some of you are conversing with this through COVID. And the bit that we know of through COVID, you hear a lot about, is the targeted immune system. You've experienced COVID before, your immune system learns and it targets antibodies and white blood cells to the COVID-19 or other viruses. Those are the 2 levels of targeted response. But there's another response, which is like a barrage that goes up, where the immune system hasn't got a bloody clue what's attacking, but it sets up a barrage of what's just called inflammation of white blood cells to try and stop or slow down whatever is coming in. So that's great if you're about to go into war, or you're playing a game of footy or tennis and you're really on the ball and anything could happen. But it's not good if it's chronic, because one of the causes of aging is this inflammation, because this inflammation is exactly like the inflammation you get when you've got a wound in your hand or wherever else, and you get scarring with the wound. That's the inflammatory response. And what happens when you've got too much inflammation is you get too much scarring. And one of the first places that happens is in your heart and in the blood vessels around your heart, but it also happens in the blood vessels around your brain. So this chronic response can, not always, prematurely age the body. It changes your immune system, how your hormones work. A hormone called cortisol goes up in your bloodstream, which is another stress hormone. And that hormone can put you at increased risk, for example, of diabetes and overeating and so on. So these manifestations of a psychological environment through to your heart are very, very tangible indeed. And that's why mental health issues also affect your heart. It's not so much through acute stress and your heart's going to fall over. It's exactly through the same thing, is that it's psychologically stressful, having depression, having anxiety, and it affects your heart through these processes that I've talked about. So actually, psychological well-being is really important. So if you have that sense of churning anxiety, where you get up in the morning and you just got that churning and you find it very hard to get rid of, or you're losing interest in the world around you and you're not wanting to do things that you used to do, and you're just managing to, with your fingernails in the ground, get through your work in a day. If you recognize that in yourself, get it seen to. Often it's biological rather than necessarily a response to the environment around you. And you need help. And if you see it in somebody that you work with, a brittleness, an unhappiness, they're not active, they're not doing stuff the way they used to, then the "are you okay" idea is very sound. You don't have to be the therapist, but you just need to say to somebody, "Are you okay?" And if they're not, you find ways, and most large organizations that are watching this today have their own employee assistance schemes and other things, or Beyond Blue and other places can offer you assistance. So the body is one. So while I'm here to talk to you about your heart health, if all I spoke to you about was your heart and your arteries, I would be doing you a disservice, because there's bigger stuff going on. And again, I'm repeating myself, the brain runs everything. And don't forget that, whatever you do. So one of the things I looked at in my book, well, actually, let me just deal, before I get down to more specifics, let me deal with some stuff that people get obsessed with. One is supplements. I have no idea how many are in supplements, but a study and I know it's a different age group, it's different ages of people watching this session. However, a study in New South Wales of people aged 45 and over, a large number of people, 250,000 of them, 45% were taking fish oil. And the story with supplements is most of them should work, but in fact, when you study them, they don't. So fish oil, for example, it's been said, well, it stops sudden cardiac arrest. Unfortunately, with the larger trials, there's really not much evidence of that. You don't do yourself any harm by taking fish oil. Maybe your blood's a little bit thinner, but you don't do yourself any harm, but you don't do yourself an awful lot of good. And if you want to prevent things like inflammation in the joints through arthritis, you're actually going to take quite a lot of fish oil rather than just the usual dose. And so it's true of other supplements. One of the other processes that ages your heart, your arteries, ages your brain, ages the rest of your body is something called oxidative stress. So when we do a deal with the devil, in a sense, to stay alive. We stay alive by breathing in air, but what we need from air is the oxygen. And oxygen is needed by all our tissues. No oxygen, no life. We need to do that. However, when we breathe in oxygen, the oxygen splits off into atoms, which are highly reactive. And just the same way as oxygen rusts iron in the environment, it rusts our body from the inside out. Biological rust. And it's another core part of aging. And you can speed up oxidative stress and you can slow it down. So there's some evidence that if you control allostatic load, there's chronic stress, that oxidative stress slows down. And there are all sorts of things that increase it. Now, it's called oxidative stress because you get oxidation. In other words, the iron outside adds oxygen, so you get ferrous oxide, which is, or ferric oxide, I can't remember which one it is, which is rust. And inside your body, oxygen oxidizes. So you'd think that an antioxidant stops oxidative stress. And antioxidants like vitamin E, beta carotene, maybe vitamin C, in the test tube seem to have an effect, but in the body, they don't. There's no evidence, for example, that vitamin E prevents anything at all, supplements prevents anything at all. Beta carotene in people who've got a history of smoking is not very good for you. Vitamin C in low doses in food is an antioxidant and does slow down oxidative stress, but that's in food. In high doses in supplements is a pro-oxidant, speeds up aging. So here's the funny thing, is that biological substances don't behave necessarily the same way at different doses. And nobody's quite sure of the right dose when you're taking it artificially in a synthetic form. So oxidative stress is important, but the supplements that you might take over the counter don't seem to have a significant effect when they've been studied in very large numbers. I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of people. It's a very different story, though, about food. And this is where, obviously, diet comes in. So a lot of talks about heart health start with diet. I start with the head and then work into because part of what goes on around you is your culture, your environment, your belief systems. Those all affect how your brain reacts to the world around. So the second longest, here's a quiz. Who are the second longest lived people in the world after the Japanese? Well, researchers in Melbourne have claimed that it's Greek Australians living in Melbourne, older Greek Australians living in Melbourne. In other words, people who were born in Greece but came to live in Australia. And it's extraordinary. They don't necessarily look that healthy. They can often be overweight, but they do live significantly longer than Anglo-Australians. Now, whenever I tell people that, they instantly jump to the conclusion, it's the Mediterranean diet. And there's no question, the Mediterranean diet is great for your heart. It really is proven. But you've got to watch when you talk about the Mediterranean diet, because just think of all the countries around the Mediterranean. You've got Tunisia, you've got Egypt, you've got Morocco, I'm not sure you've done that the other way around, Israel, Turkey, etc. When you go to Italy, for example, they suffer the face of prosciutto. I love prosciutto. You probably do too if you have it. It's not good for you. It's a processed meat. So the diet in Italy is very different from the diet elsewhere. The Mediterranean diet that's associated with good heart health is actually the diet of the Greek islands. And when you look, and most of the people, a lot of the Greeks who migrated to Melbourne were actually from the islands. And so they say, well, okay, I know all about this anyway. You don't eat red meat very much. Once a week, you don't have too much fish, but you have a bit of fish and you get your protein from legumes. Yeah, I know all that. Well, that misses a very important point. Now, if you're eating an ultra-processed diet, by the way, ultra-processed diets are really not good for you. A lot of proof about that. The jury is out about things like protein balls and so on, but that is ultra-processed food as well. We don't know about that, but we're talking about stuff that's packaged on the supermarket shelves. If you move away from an ultra-processed diet to a raw diet, so you take all the elements of a Mediterranean diet and you have it raw, that's a really good move and it's going to be really good for you. But in fact, the real secret of the Mediterranean diet is the cuisine, how you cook, because cooking is chemistry. So they've done experiments, for example, at Deakin University. So this work is done by a researcher called Tanya Thodis at Deakin, and Catherine Itsiopoulos, who left Deakin to become Pro-Vice Chancellor at Murdoch in WA. And their work, and what they did, for example, is that they would take a tomato. Now, when you take a tomato and you eat it raw, great, it's really good for you. If you finally chop that tomato, it's even better because it starts to release stuff in the tomato. If you pour extra virgin olive oil, and that's all you do, just like a dressing over the tomato, it's even better because there's a reaction in the tomato and it releases even more what I call bioactive substances. They have an antioxidant effect, but they're much more than that. I'll come back to that in a minute. But if you then take a red capsicum or a tomato, chop it, pour extra virgin olive oil on it, and stick it under the griller and cook it or put in a pot, that releases antioxidants and bioactive compounds that you cannot buy in a pharmacy. They are so potent that they have an enormous effect on lowering inflammation, lowering oxidative stress, changing your microbiome so that your microbiome becomes much more diverse and healthy, and produces substances called short-chain fatty acids, which then have an influence on your brain and your arteries itself. So it's what you take in, its response, and your microbiome adding to that and settling down your immune system as well. So it's cooking. So when you think about the cooking, it's extra virgin olive oil in the pot, chopping onions, garlic, herbs, I'll come back to herbs in a second, tomatoes, carrots, the sofrito mix is the basis of a lot of Mediterranean dishes. The substances in that are amazing. So you can go to a fancy 5-star restaurant and talk to the chef. The chef will tell you cooking is chemistry, and they know what the effect they get. So this is a chemistry set in the pot. They cook at moderate heat, because when you burn food, such as in a barbecue, much as I love it, you probably love it too, that burnt bit, that caramelization, that layer has actually pro-oxidant properties. They're called advanced glycation end products, and they speed up aging. So by and large, Greek island cooking is at moderate heat, slow cooking. If they do cook red meat like lamb, it's a 10-hour lamb, just slowly done in a wood fire oven. But coming back to the herbs, and remember this is Melbourne, they'll have an allotment or a backyard and they'll grow their own herbs and vegetables. And if they don't do that, or it's out of season, they are very particular about freshness. And so don't go shopping with the Greek nonna. It's a nightmare. And by the way, don't go shopping with a Vietnamese Australian nonna either. The Vietnamese diet, for example, is very similar to the Mediterranean diet. It looks different, it tastes different because of the spices and herbs and so on, but there's a lot of similarities in terms of how they cook. Even the stir fry is not as hot as you think and is flash cooked and doesn't burn. And the Vietnamese diet, and Vietnamese Australians also live a disproportionately long time. And again, there are similarities there. If you don't believe me, go to Cabramatta in Sydney, if you're ever in Sydney on a Sunday, and just look at the best vegetables in Sydney and herbs and vegetables are there in Cabramatta. Just amazing quality. So everything's fresh. Freshness is more important than organic. They eat with family and friends. Remember, the brain runs everything. And so there's social contact, social support. And they're getting a bit of exercise in the garden, what have you. And then finally, they still belong to the Greek Orthodox Church. And the Greek Orthodox Church has over 100 fast days a year. But these aren't Michael Mosley fasts. These are days of frugality, where you don't eat animal protein, you eat plant food for a day, and you're supposed to be very modest in your eating. So there are, maybe 30% of the year is spent in a frugal eating mode. And this goes along with, let's go to things like intermittent. So that's the package. And it's a package that a lot of us could actually absorb and take in. Now, let's talk about intermittent fasting, for example, which a lot of you were doing, either the 16-8, so that's, you fast for 6 hours and then you are allowed to eat during an 8-hour period. Probably doesn't matter which time of day you do that, although probably earlier in the day to do your eating is better than later in the day. So intermittent fasting emulates one of the things that's known to protect your heart and reduce the aging process. If you reduce the aging process and slow it down, it's going to benefit your heart and blood vessels as well, because it's just all part of the same thing. And now, what happens with intermittent? What we know is that if you create a calorie gap in your life, that you're burning more calories than you are taking in, that metabolic stress is really, that metabolic stress is actually slows down oxidative stress and slows down the aging process and is anti-inflammatory. The problem with hardcore intermittent fasting is that your body gets used to stuff, and the calorie gap can narrow because the body says, well, you're starving me of calories, and therefore while you're sitting, like I'm sitting now or you're sitting, I'm going to burn fewer calories when I'm sitting. I've got that option. And if your resting metabolic rate goes down, you are burning fewer calories and the calorie gap narrows, you get fewer benefits. And what research at the University of Sydney has shown is that you're not free to eat what you like on your 5 days on or your 8 hours on. It's not do what you like, because if you do what you like and eat anything in those 5 days or that 8 hours, you don't get the metabolic benefit. You've actually got to eat a Mediterranean style diet with all its diversity during that time to get that benefit and that gap. And there's another really important concept that I talk about a lot, which tends to clear up the mystery about why supplements don't tend to work, at least at the moment. It's called homeostasis, fancy name. What it means is we survive because our human bodies are really good at balance, about staying in balance. So that if our blood pressure goes up, there's a system in our body to bring our blood pressure down. Our pulse goes up, there's a system in our body to bring it down. If our immune system becomes more active, there's a system to bring it down. But with chronically up, it gets harder to pull it down. So the body has these yin and yang. So for everything you do to it, there's something else that will pull it back so that it stays rock solid. But the process of aging tilts the balance. So I talk about the Leaning Tower of Pisa. So once upon a time, the Leaning Tower of Pisa was straight up and down. And imagine that's the balance in your body. So just the yin and yang keeps it straight up and down. And imagine that straight up and down is your youthful profile. So things are going well and your body's nice and youthful and there's lots of good things going on. But as time goes on, inevitably, it starts to tilt towards aging. But as it tilts, it tilts so slowly that your body doesn't fight against it. The body wakes up one day and realizes there's a tilt on, but that tilt becomes normal. And then what a lot of these supplements do, and in animals like fruit fly and rats and so on, it tends to work, but in humans it doesn't. So you try and push, these supplements are trying to push that balance back towards its youthful profile. But what happens is that youthful profile is no longer normal for the body. What becomes normal is the tilt. And so if you prod it, it might work for a little bit. And so I'm thinking of things like resveratrol, NMN boosters, NAD boosters, quercetin. There's a whole series of these supplements that imitate calorie restriction, but also push systems back to a more youthful profile. The problem is that if you go in and get this huge dose of an NAD booster, if you can find one, and prod it, it might work for a little bit, but then the body says, bugger off. Something's happening here, and I'm going to resist this. And the body goes back to the tilt because the tilt is what the body knows is normal. And it's thought that, so we haven't got a clue what the right dose of these supplements are. So they should work. They work in the lab, they work in animals, they extend lifespan. You've got to watch animal research because it's often in selected animals that are genetically chosen for their sensitivity to these things. So animal research is not necessarily that reliable, but it's thought that probably one day what will happen is somebody will work out what the right dose is. And it's probably a tiny dose. And it's probably in combination with a whole series of these supplements. And you probably will only give it once a week or once a fortnight so that you can confuse the body. And so when you tilt it, the body, you don't tilt it for long enough or aggressively enough that the body fights back and the body might move a little bit. And then a couple of weeks later, you do it again and move it upright. The other thing that people go off for to try and rejuvenate the cells in your body and reduce the risk of heart disease and aging, because remember, what's good for your heart is good for your brain. is stem cells. So there used to be this thing, it's less so now after COVID, people used to jump in a plane, go to Germany for stem cell research, stem cells, because the argument is that your body ages, your arteries age, your heart ages because your stem cells, the cells that produce new tissue, are aged and not doing that as well. And fascinating research here. So they've looked at what happens in stem cells when you take young stem cells and you put it into older people, is that the stem cells become old stem cells. So the young cells become old. There's also been this fascinating stuff. There's a market out here for getting transfused with a young person's blood, because there's evidence in animals that if you do that, that you rejuvenate, that there's some rejuvenation thing going on. So they start, well, what is it? So this is the notion that young people have got something in them, the elixir of youth, that if only older people would get it, solves all our problems. And it's been an ancient thing going back thousands of years. So they did these fascinating experiments where they hooked up an older mouse to a younger mouse, the blood supply. So the hypothesis was the younger mouse would rejuvenate the older mouse. You know what happened? The older mouse clapped out the younger mouse, and the younger mouse aged. What happens when you get older is that stuff builds up in your blood, in your cells. You get old cells hanging around, and that's what the problem is. And it turns out the rejuvenating effect of a blood transfusion, a young blood transfusion, they said, well, what is it in that? So they gave a placebo, in other words, a saline drip to people, and found that a saline drip was just as effective as the blood. So it wasn't no effect, it was an effect. And it turns out that what was happening here was the blood or the saline was diluting these pro-aging compounds in our body and making them less toxic or less aging. So a lot of stuff is counterintuitive. And so let me just summarize before I go on to this, because we're running out of time here. What are the takeaway messages here? Your brain runs everything. I'm not talking about happiness here. I'm talking about well-being. I'm not talking about wellness, some concept that you've got to write every morning to jump out of bed, go over to the sink and admire your washboard abdomen. If you're a woman, go over to the sink to wash your pearly white teeth, and your kids are perfect, and you've got thin thighs and a beautiful body, and everything's great. That's not normal. We have ups and downs. We have good days and bad days. How would you know that you're well if every day you felt fabulous? And we've got this, somehow some of us have got this notion we've got a right to feel fabulous every day. We don't feel fabulous every day. How would you know if you felt well, if you felt fabulous every day? You wouldn't know what wellness is. You only know what wellness is that most of the time we feel crap when we get up in the morning. It becomes pathological when there's an up, and when it stays down, when you feel crap all the time. I haven't gone on to sleep. What's important about sleep is your sleep quality, not so much how long you sleep. It's getting a good night's sleep. And I don't have time here to talk that through. It is important for your heart health. It's important for your brain health as well. But it's not to get panicky. I'm sleeping 6 hours a night and I'm going to get dementia. It's more, do you wake up feeling refreshed? How often are you waking up? And you all know about sleep hygiene, dark room, don't have screens on, don't have your alarm clock facing you, and don't watch television in your bedrooms for sleeping and sex, and that's it. But that's only part of the sleep therapy thing. But the best sleep therapy in the world, there's all sorts of things you do for it, just changes you from a bad night's sleeper to a good night's sleeper. It improves the quality of life. Doesn't turn you from a 6-hour a night to an 8-hour night sleeper. So summarizing the takeaways here, particularly at work, is mental well-being is important. And if you notice that in a colleague or yourself, seek help, because it will help your heart health as well. Friendships are really important. Social support, how many people around you? You've got to invest in the people around you at home and at work, and because that is great for your heart health as well as your general well-being. Know what your risk is at any age. So you can't smoke. If you're worried about your health, Do not smoke. Do not smoke burnt plants, whether it's tobacco, marijuana, or what have you. Smoking burnt plants is really bad for you and pro-oxidant and pro-aging, not to mention the carcinogenic effects. Make sure your blood pressure is normal, your cholesterol is down, and you know what your family history is. And so you know what your cardiac risk profile is at least once a decade, and get that sorted. And think about your diet. The more diverse your diet, the better. I know it's hard when you're working hard, but try cooking, and cook in the Mediterranean style at moderate heat with lots of vegetables, legumes for protein, nuts as well to a certain extent, because again, nut eating is also important for heart health. And and be frugal every few days if you can. And exercise is really important. And the exercise gets better and better the more intense that it is. Moderate exercise most days of the week for at least 45 minutes to an hour is as good as HIIT in the short form. So if you're short of time, do HIIT. But if you've got time, do moderate exercise. But it means getting out of breath. And it means if you're starting from scratch and you find it challenging walking on the flat, but 2 weeks later you're not finding it challenging, you've got to keep on challenging yourself. And you've got to have strong muscles. Strong muscles help you metabolize sugar and keep diabetes at bay, as well as stopping you becoming frail when you get much older. And diabetes is very toxic for your heart. So strong muscles, so you've got to mix in muscle strengthening with your aerobic exercise. And as many of you would know, a muscle strengthening session is often quite aerobic as well. So you've got to keep your muscles there taut. And if you can get out at lunchtime to do some exercise and make it reasonably intense, it will improve your day. It will improve alertness and so on. But equally, and it depends on families and so on. It's probably much more important to eat a good dinner with your family and reconnect with your family rather than have your lunch at work and you don't want to eat your dinner and you're not communing with friends and family. You just got to be sensible about that. And if you're feeling chronically stressed at work and you're feeling that locus of control, you need to talk to your boss about it and express those feelings, because those feelings are not great to have. And work out, try to work out why you're having them. Burnout is more about chronic stress than true burnout. Burnout is not a medical condition. Burnout is usually a combination of anxiety, what's called psychological distress, not feeling efficacious at work, and it's not necessarily all to do with work either. But that sort of stress is not good for your heart either. So it's about being self-aware, seeking help, and not being embarrassed about it. So those are my takeaways, and let's move to questions, and they're coming in. So one question from Sean is, how effective are CT coronary angiograms, when and how often to get one done? So CT coronary angiogram is an amazing CAT scan of your heart, which shows up the blood vessels of your heart. It's not yet a routine screening test for people who are at normal risk of coronary heart disease, but it'll often be used by cardiologists to sort out people who may be having chest pains, or indeed people who may have a strong family risk and their cholesterol is up a little bit or their blood pressure is up a little bit. They may do a coronary CT angiogram to check, because it's a fairly simple test to do. Now, what it's really good for are two things. One is, if it shows that your arteries are clear, then your arteries are clear and you can relax a lot about your heart health. Not to change your lifestyle, but know that there's nothing brewing there. It's also quite good at picking up young narrowings that are early. The really dangerous narrowings in your heart, you've heard of people in their 40s and 50s killing over from cardiac arrest, but it's often because the narrowing in their arteries is relatively young and immature and hasn't solidified. And therefore, a game of squash or an active run or whatever, maybe an infection, blows it up and you can get a heart attack or a cardiac arrest. It's not that common, but it can occur. Now, a Mediterranean diet settles that down. The antioxidants and so on all settle that down. Getting your cholesterol down settles that down, that immature. And that risk of a cardiac arrest gets less, paradoxically, as you get older. But it's good at showing up those early lesions. And if it shows you a lesion, then they'll go in and do a more definitive angiogram. So nobody knows how often it should be done. It depends what they find first time around. And often they won't repeat it because either it's normal, clear, or it shows something and they investigate that something. I hope that answers the question. Jenny asks, if I feel stress at work, which lifts my heart rate considerably, what should I do? Well, exercise is really good if you can find the time for that, and exercise that really pushes you and gives you, gets your heart rate up and focuses you on the exercise. I suggest to people that they don't, I mean, this is me now, but they don't, you don't plug in your phones and have stuff going through your ears because that distracts you. Exercise is also a mindful exercise, is mindfulness. And you probably get more out of it if you've got nothing going into your ears apart from the ambient sound around you. And you focus on the exercise. How fast am I running? How am I feeling? Am I pushing myself? Am I progressing? And so on. And that period of mindfulness with exercise also helps. So mindfulness meditation is pretty good. And you can do that at work as well. I'm a champion. Sorry, I've just lost my thing here. I'm a champion napper at work. So when I get stressed at work, it's often because I haven't had a good night's sleep, and I'm unembarrassed about finding a corner and napping. And the way I nap, here's how I do it, and I do it through mindfulness, but I don't do it through. Is that I focus on the noise around me. So I don't necessarily find a quiet spot. I just find a spot that I know people aren't going to walk by and think, here's this old guy, who's decrepit and having a sleep. I've been doing it for many years, by the way. I focus on the noise around me. So I focus really hard. When I'm on a plane, I'm asleep by the time the plane takes off. And how I do that is focusing on the safety message because it's so boring. And I really focus on it really, really hard. And that gets me off to sleep, funnily enough. So having a sleep, but again, learning mindfulness meditation is a good thing to do, and it's been shown to be a really good stress reliever. And understanding the source of your stress. If it's a deadline, I've got to get a proposal out and do that. Know that the stress will be over in 2 or 3 days' time, and you just got to go with it because some acute stress is good for performance at work. Analyze whether or not the real problem is anxiety. And that anxiety is making me stressed about work, in which case you want to get to the bottom of the anxiety and get help for that. So there's no easy answers, but that's some of them. Michael asks, how important is keeping LDL low? If I'm otherwise healthy, should I be concerned about out of the normal LDL? Will statins make me live longer? Okay, so there's different kinds of cholesterol mixed up in the word cholesterol. There's high density lipoprotein cholesterol, which is the good form of cholesterol, which takes cholesterol away from the arteries. By the way, the things that raise HDL naturally, like exercise and weight loss, are good for you. But taking drugs that raise HDL, something funny going on here which nobody understands, are not necessarily good for you. Nobody knows the reason why. The real culprit here is LDL, low density lipoprotein, because that takes cholesterol into the cell associated with inflammation. Remember that inflammation I talked about? When you've got that inflammation, it opens up the arteries to cholesterol to allow it to come in. It oxidizes the cholesterol, so it rusts the cholesterol, and that's the beginning of coronary heart disease. So you want your LDL to be as low as it can be. And nobody has plumbed the depths. If you look at hunter-gatherer societies, their LDLs are really low. So if your LDL is raised, you want to get it down. And the test that goes on, it's important to notice what your triglycerides are on that blood test, because if your triglycerides are up, and the cause of that is a fat tummy often, poor diet, too much sugar in your diet, too much unrefined carbohydrates. That, for any given level of LDL, if your triglycerides are up, that makes it worse. So you want to get your triglycerides down, your LDL down. Now, if you're younger, diet, exercise, weight loss, being careful about your alcohol intake will all help to reduce your LDL and avoid the need for drugs. But if it's persistently high, then you do need a statin. And and the question is, at what age should you start that? And it depends on the level. Some quite young people can go, with very high LDLs, get it, and it saves their lives. Christy asks, I've had high blood pressure on medication. It started on and off since the age of 25. I believe it's stress, but not sure how I can stop it. So how I can prevent it. Some people have a genetic risk for high blood pressure. And no matter what you do, it stays high. And so some people have a genetic risk for cholesterol and it's high. And the only thing that brings it down is medication. You may be, I can't give you advice, Christy, for you personally, but you may be one of those people. You've got to be very careful about stopping medication. But if your blood pressure's up a bit, then there are things we know that help to bring your blood pressure down. Exercise, according to the exercise guidelines, 150 minutes a week, moderate exercise, will tend to bring your blood pressure down about, significantly, not hugely, but enough to make a difference. Salt intake. If you reduce your salt intake, that will also reduce your blood pressure. If you reduce your alcohol intake, that will also reduce your blood pressure and your weight. So visceral fat is really not good for anything. Increases inflammation and goes along with high blood pressure. And if you really get into those I don't know whether you have, Christy, or not, into those lifestyle changes, you wouldn't stop your blood pressure medication, but maybe you need less. And if you're going to change anything, you need to talk to your doctor about it. But blood pressure, next to smoking, is the most pro-aging thing that you can do. And next to that is blood pressure, because that battering on your arteries for decades, and you've had it since your 20s, is really toxic and pro-aging. But what they've shown, and the research is really good in this, what's important is to have a normal blood pressure. And it doesn't matter why you've got a normal blood pressure. So if you've had a high blood pressure and you're under blood pressure treatment and your blood pressure is now normal, that's fine. That solves the problem. It's the high blood pressure that is the issue. Joe asks, we've been bombarded for years that tomatoes, nuts, and oats are good for you. Recently, I watched a video by a medical professional that claims that they contain lectin, which is not good for your gut. Is this true? I don't think it's true at all. The overwhelming evidence is that these red vegetables, multicolored vegetables, not just red vegetables, purple vegetables, yellow vegetables, orange vegetables, they produce a range of antioxidants or bioactive compounds that are really good for you, change your microbiome. If they were bad for you, then you'd have people falling over dead in Mediterranean countries, and they're far from falling over dead. They're living longer than we are. So the proof of the pudding, as they say, is in the eating. Shawnee says, if I'm getting an annual checkup at the doctor's, what are the basic tests? I swear a doctor is the baseline. There's very little value in an annual checkup if you're otherwise well. And I talk about this in one of my books. In fact, there's a little bit of harm associated with that. So if you're getting an annual checkup because you've got a problem like blood pressure or heart disease or cholesterol and so on, that's a really good reason for an annual checkup, or your blood sugar. And I haven't spoken much about blood sugar. But to start off with, the basic tests are blood pressure, cholesterol, your waist circumference, finding out how much exercise you're doing, and maybe a random blood sugar. So while they're taking blood, you might do a fasting blood sugar to see what that's doing in case you're running towards diabetes. Those are the basic tests. Did I say cholesterol? Those are the basic tests to do. And if they're up, then you do need to follow through with your doctor, sometime in the next year to make sure they're coming down. But if they're normal and you're otherwise healthy, then you'll work out with your doctor. You probably don't need to be seen annually, but I'm not giving you that advice. You need to talk to your doctor about it. I've run out of time. Can I thank you all so much for joining me in this session? And I hope you have a fabulous day. And thanks to Medibank for putting this session on, and they'll let you know when the next one is happening. See ya.